All right, everyone. This is Mark Rogers of Mark Rogers TV. Welcome to our college football coast to coast show. We are launching here on a college football playoff night. We've got Stephanie Otey joining us. She does a lot of work for the Big Ten Network, also ESPN, some production work behind the scenes, and has some good things going there. And we've talked some college football with Stephanie. So, of course, the big announcement, Stephanie, with the College Football Playoff Committee releasing its first rankings. So this is going to send college football fans crazy on whether their team's in or would be out at this point. And there's so much football left to be played. Just your initial thoughts about the whole process and what you saw out of the first top 25.
Yeah, I'm not too surprised on much. I'm happy to see that they looked at the teams from a visual standpoint and then what they have on their resume. That's what I was happy to see. And you could clearly tell they're not considering too much about last season. But overall, not too surprised. I think November is very, very telling and what's going to happen with these rankings. So
Yeah,
a lot
so
of football.
we've got Clemson in the number one spot. The Tigers have the marquee win against Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm.
I think in evaluating teams and evaluating the performance on the field, it should be considered that Clemson barely did get by Notre Dame. That's still a really good win, but it was at home, and it was in a game in which Notre Dame dropped a zillion passes in which it could have won. So to me, based on what I'm hearing out of the College Football Playoff Committee, is that they obviously look at wins and losses. That's most important. But then they're also looking at the advanced statistics and metrics. And then thirdly, they're going with the eyeball test. Who do they truly believe are the better teams? And so they're telling us that about Clemson. The metrics are very strong with Clemson, but their best win is Notre Dame. That's a very strong win, but it wasn't that impressive in my eye in regards to a dominant performance. And they've got some sluggish wins against North Carolina State and Louisville, two teams that aren't really that good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I see in a couple of the highly ranked teams, there have been some messy wins, but I think that they're looking at the team itself too. Like, there's a ton of talent clearly in Clemson, Baylor, Ohio State, but their records are great, but some of those wins weren't the best thing to watch. So that, I think that they're definitely considering strength of schedule as well too. But I think they're looking at the team as a whole and the players that fill it.
So do you have an issue with Alabama being rated ahead of a bunch of one-loss or zero-loss teams?
I kind of do. But then again, their schedules compared to some of the teams that are also ranked, it kind of evens out. But yeah, I mean, because we discussed Iowa undefeated, clearly getting overlooked, and then even Oklahoma State. But I think that maybe next weekend when the rankings come out again, we'll be able to tell more about what the committee's thinking about those teams.
There's no question that there's bias involved. And I'm not saying that people come in with an agenda, but we're all naturally biased. And because a computer's not spitting out the final rankings, there's a subjectivity to it. So in the case of Iowa, there's no question. There's a predisposition to start the season that Iowa's not going to be involved in this process, but they have played their way into this process. If you look at Ohio State and you look at Iowa, and I'm trying to make my argument in that I'm not saying that Iowa's better than Ohio State. If they played tomorrow, and they may play in the Big Ten championship game, I believe that Ohio State's a more talented team. They're better than Iowa. I would expect them to win by 2 touchdowns, maybe 20 points. I think Iowa's played a better season. They have played against a better schedule. They have 3 wins in Pitt, Wisconsin, and Northwestern that are 3 better wins than anything Ohio State has. The only comparable one would be a Penn State win. But we have a known commodity in Ohio State. They did it last year. They did it with basically the same team, and they're the preseason number 1 team. So they're getting a huge advantage in this process, I think, over the likes of Michigan State and Iowa.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, I love that you're supporting Iowa, but I think ultimately the only way to test it is if for the 2 teams to play. But I'm also iffy about the end of Ohio State season. That's where the chunk of their competition is. And they're so unpredictable with JT out this weekend. I don't think it's going to be too big of a difference for their season, but you never know what's going to happen. I mean, we lost our quarterback 3 games before the end of season, or with 3 games left to play. And so, you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, so we've seen with Alabama here making the top 4 with a loss already. So Ohio State made it to a national championship game last year, but they had to overcome the early season loss, and they were number 16 in the first college football rankings and had to continue to win all the way through. Alabama's already earned the spot according to the College Football Playoff Committee, despite already having the loss. So if they win out, they're obviously in great shape. They're going to be in, versus an Ohio State and Iowa, Michigan State out of the Big Ten. And I'll point to those teams. You could say the same thing about Clemson. If they lose, they're losing down the stretch, and that's most likely going to knock them out.
And I didn't see where TCU was ranked, but I definitely thought they should have been in the top 6. Maybe over Notre Dame. But just like what we're going to see this weekend, they have a matchup against Baylor at the last game of the season. So, I mean, I was a little shocked that they weren't in the top 6, just because of especially their game this past week.
Yeah, it was noted in the broadcast that Baylor's strength of schedule right now is 109th. But that it's going to be 9th from here on out. So they have a backloaded schedule, just like TCU has a backloaded schedule. They play all the best teams in their own conference near the end, much like Ohio State. I don't think that Baylor's end of schedule is going to be 9th when it's all said and done, because when they defeat the teams that are currently have strong records that comprise this strength of schedule, they're going to have losses. So that 9th schedule rating for Baylor down the stretch isn't going to stay 9th.
Well, if you look at the quality of the wins for Baylor, they were in the 60s almost every game. So, I mean, when they're playing these not so great teams, they're dominating them. Whereas I have to, get on my Buckeyes a little bit. They didn't have a dominant win. So that's where I see, maybe Baylor should have been up a little bit higher in those rankings, just because they're dominating, and the Buckeyes haven't had a crazy win like Baylor has consistently had.
Yeah, they are dominating. They're dominating everyone. I would say that the best team that they've played is Texas Tech, which is a good team, probably a top 50 team, not a great team. They've lost 3 or 4 games, but they're a decent team, and that's not been their closest game, actually, against Iowa State. Baylor got a little bit of a challenge in the second half, but it really wasn't anything that formidable. Won that game by 15, 16, 17 points, but basically everybody else, they're winning by 50 points. And like you say, they're scoring 60, 65, 70 points on everyone. But down the road, they've got Oklahoma. They've got Oklahoma State coming up this week, I believe.
This weekend we have 3 matchups: TCU versus Oklahoma State, LSU versus Alabama, and Clemson versus Florida State.
Yeah, so Florida State gets a chance to jump back into this. It's do or die right now. They're going to be out, or they're going to play themselves back into contention if they can go out and beat Clemson on the road. So this is a last-ditch effort for Florida State, and obviously this is going to allow them to also play in the conference championship game if they beat Clemson. Otherwise, it's done for them. Right. You mentioned TCU and Oklahoma State, correct? So that's key right there. Obviously, the Cowboys come in undefeated, but they're lowly considered, much like Baylor, although Baylor had that preseason hype, that preseason perception that they were going to be one of the best teams, where Oklahoma State didn't. So Oklahoma State's 8-0 doesn't really play into it right now, but they can make up for that this Saturday.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it'll be a very interesting weekend, to say the least. And you never even know if one of these top teams loses to a team that's not so highly ranked, what that'll do. So, yeah,
definitely.
There's a lot that can change.
We've got Breezy out there. We got Tim out there. So if you guys have any comments or questions, definitely send them our way. We're going to go for about another 15 minutes. So I think that LSU, if we look at the resume, I think that LSU has been extremely strong. They've got a win against Florida. They unfortunately didn't play anyone outside of conference, as they typically do. Their big win was against Syracuse, so that's not a whole lot there. But LSU is got Alabama lined up this week, as you mentioned, and they've got Ole Miss coming up. So like most of these teams, again, they've backloaded the schedule. The conference is backloaded the schedule basically, and the teams that you can really look at and say we won a substantial game is Clemson beating Notre Dame, is LSU with a Florida win in conference, is Alabama's gone out, and now some of their wins don't look so as impressive because some of these teams have faltered. Alabama beat Texas A&M, they beat Georgia, which Georgia was a top 10 team, and they're nowhere to be found now. That was not a real quality win for Alabama.
Now, when it comes to Notre Dame, what would you say was their big win? I know Temple, they just beat them, number 20, but Temple came out of nowhere. So that's what I was a little surprised about their rank as number 5, especially Baylor.
I do think, Stephanie, that Notre Dame is riding the coattails of the Clemson game. They went to Clemson. They got down early. They made a comeback. It was very close. They had a play at the goal line to basically take the lead and win the game. They scored. That's right. It was a 6-point game. That's right. So it was an 8-point game. They scored the touchdown. They went for the 2-point conversion. They didn't convert it. So they played Clemson to the hilt on the road at Clemson. So they are getting a ton of cachet for that. Otherwise, the wins aren't great for Notre Dame. USC, that's a quality win. Texas, not so much. Virginia, not so much. The Temple game, the one that you just mentioned, would probably be the best win for Notre Dame at this point. They've got a date with Stanford down the line on the last day of the season. So that's going to be huge for Notre Dame and for Stanford, who is right now the favorite to win the Pac-12.
Now, we don't see much of the Pac-12, though. So
you don't see much of the Pac-12.
Yeah, where are they in the rankings?
You're buried in the I thought you were talking about watching the games. Okay.
Oh, no, yeah.
No, we don't.
Buried in here somewhere.
No, this was the big argument at the beginning of the season was best conference, SEC, Pac-12, and they're beating each other. And teams like UCLA, USC, Oregon, not nearly as good as we thought they were.
Yeah.
And they lost some big games. Oregon lost out of conference to Michigan State.
So that's
they completely fell after that. Yeah, the Pac-12 is hanging on to Stanford. Even though Utah is only one spot behind Stanford, I think it's going to be difficult for Utah to win out. They've got games with Arizona and UCLA coming up in particular, where Stanford, I think, again, aside from the Notre Dame game, I think they're going to make the Pac-12 championship game. So the entire Pac-12 is just hanging on to Stanford and hoping that they can run through.
Yeah. So, I mean, I unfortunately don't see them making it to the playoffs, but, if Stanford's their last hope, and especially if they have a matchup against Notre Dame.
So, Stephanie, if we head to Vegas, who do you like? Who are you betting on to make it to the Final Four?
To the Final Four. I mean, I have long said LSU, Clemson. I'm getting a little nervous about my Buckeyes, to be honest. I think that they'll be able to beat Michigan State, but I don't know about Michigan. I mean, Michigan doesn't have the wins, but I mean, they're playing well. So I'm getting nervous about the Buckeyes, but I'll leave them in my Final Four. And then I'm going to go with, I'm torn between Baylor and TCU. That last week of November will be very telling. But for now, I'm going to stick with Baylor. So I have LSU, Clemson, Ohio State, and Baylor.
Okay. So let me nail you down here on the Ohio State situation. Are you concerned that Ohio State's going to lose, or are you concerned that they're not going to be able to hang on to a top 4 rating?
I think that they have the talent to stay in the Final Four, but I'm nervous that they're going to get a loss, but either Michigan State or Michigan. And then it's just going to go.
That would do it for them, most likely. It's going to be very difficult. The only scenario I see where a second Big Ten team gets in, and a lot would have to happen in the other conferences. So you have to allow for that. So there would have to be complete chaos and carnage in the other conferences. Florida State beats Clemson. There's a loss in the ACC championship game. Ole Miss, what's very interesting in all this is everybody's looking at Alabama, LSU playing this week. If Ole Miss runs the table, they win their last 3 games, both of those teams stay at home, and Ole Miss goes to the SEC championship game. And they got 2 losses.
Yeah, yeah.
And so if they win the SEC with 2 losses, what do you do with the SEC? But my point on the Big Ten was going to be, I think the team that might be in the best position here is Michigan State.
Right. I
They
was just
beat
gonna
a
say that.
big team outside of conference in Oregon, and even though that's not a great win as much as it looked then, Oregon's starting to right the ship. They've won a couple consecutive games against decent teams, and they'll probably finish 8-4, 9-3, and they'll be a substantial team. So
Mhm.
Michigan State, let's say they go to Columbus and they lose by a point, or they lose by a field goal, and
I think that's
then
what's gonna
and
happen.
they're sitting there at 11-1, and they have an extremely strong strength of schedule. They have marquee wins. They lose to maybe the number 1 team in the country that goes on. That Michigan State could be, they have the best chance, I believe, of losing a game and making it.
Over Alabama, you'd say?
Well, in terms of anybody losing from here on out, Alabama by far has the chance. Alabama, then
If
Notre
they,
Dame,
if
but
I
definitely
don't know what's gonna
Alabama.
happen if they beat LSU. I mean, that's this weekend.
Yes.
So
Alabama, yes, if they win out, they're there. Even if they have to stay home for the SEC championship game, the College Football Playoff Committee has already shown us that a one-loss Alabama team's going to, and they're only going to strengthen their case by defeating LSU. Obviously, is going to be an enormous
I
win.
would love to see the Buckeyes play Alabama again.
Oh, you want to see that game
Oh
again?
wow, that'd be incredible. 2 years in a row.
Oh, you'd love to see that game. I would love to see some other scenarios here. My initial college football playoff selections, Stephanie, at the beginning of the season. So be kind here. Remember, I had nothing to go by. I was going preseason. So my 2 good picks, Ohio State, Alabama. My one okay pick that still has a chance, they're kind of looming, Oklahoma, 7-1.
I thought you were gonna go with Iowa. Strong supporter of Iowa.
Well, no. I'm just trying to balance the field. Like if
Right,
everybody was jumping on Iowa's bandwagon, and I was like, okay, enough with Iowa. But it's just like they're just kind of the little engine that could, and they need somebody to support them a little bit. So I'm jumping on the Iowa bandwagon. So it was
yeah.
Ohio State, Alabama for me. It was Oklahoma out of the Big 12. I was picking a wild card, and then I went with UCLA out of the Pac-12. So I'm
Okay.
done there. I still have some hopes with the other 3 preseason picks. But right now, I think Clemson's going to run the table in the ACC and make it. I think Ohio State, when we talked about it the other night, would be interesting with a 3-way tie in the Big Ten and one of those teams defeating Iowa. Think about Iowa. What if Ohio State really goes out, smacks down Michigan State in Michigan, reclaims the number 1 ranking, which they are by the AP and the coaches poll? Based on sitting at number 3 right now, they're going to be number 1 or 2. And then Iowa gives them a great game in the Big Ten championship game. And Iowa's sitting there at 12-1, with that being their one loss to the number 1 team in the country on a neutral field in a great game. They're not going to be selected, but I would be giving you some more Iowa talk if that happened.
Yeah. I unfortunately don't see them going past the Big Ten, but the thing that I'm nervous about is that Ohio State beats Michigan State, loses to Michigan, and then Michigan State and Ohio State are at that 1-loss, tiebreaker. Because then Michigan State would have beaten Michigan, but lost to the team that lost to Michigan. So
how well are you able to separate your Ohio State fandom from your unbiased judgment of what this playoff should look like?
I'm fine. Like I you know what? I'm also a big TCU fan, but
You're a TCU fan.
Yeah, I have
How did
family.
that happen?
They're actually coming to our Ohio State Michigan State game, so we'll have some Horned Frogs in the house.
Okay.
We were joking that if they made it to the playoffs, both teams, I would have to get a T-shirt, Ohio State and TCU, cut it down the middle and sew it down the seam, because I want to be able to decide.
Well, you could just wear an OSU shirt and say that the U is for TCU and maybe just paint it purple or something.
Or I could just say the Texas Christian University.
You could do that. As we note that on Sunday night, Monday Night Football, these guys love to poke the bear a little bit at Ohio State and talk about the whatever.
Right.
So, yeah, it's an interesting process. And again, I think this college football playoff committee, I have no issue with their approach. I have no issue with um, the numbers crunching versus also using the coaching acumen that they have there on that panel and the athletic directors that have football knowledge and can look at tape and break down teams and trying to combine that. I just think they have an impossible task because you've got 5 conferences, and then
Yeah.
you have the Temples and Memphises and Notre Dame this year of the world that may steal another spot from another conference. And
Uh-huh.
then who knows with some of these scenarios we're playing out where 2 teams could earn a spot from one conference and you could have 3 conferences left out. You could have all sorts of crazy scenarios. I just don't like cramming 5 conferences into 4 spots. I think it should be an 18 playoff, but that's possibly way down the road.
Right, right. I agree with that.
All right, Stephanie, it was good to have you again.
You too.
And
Thanks for having me. I could always talk college football.
yes, love talking college football. And this just makes for great debate and great discussion.
Right,
This
right.
just sets it up right here. And this is where we stand. And for those people out there where your team is maybe not quite where you want it to be, remember, let's take from Ohio State at number 16 last year in the first college football playoff rankings. There's a lot of football left to be played. And most of these teams are going to knock each other out as they start to play more difficult games going down the stretch. So glad to be joined by Stephanie Otey. I'm Mark Rogers, Mark Rogers TV, and this is College Football Coast to Coast on Blab. And join us every Monday at 1 p.m. I'm on to do my College Football Coast to Coast show and also a number of videos and podcasts on YouTube as well. So, Stephanie, where can we find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm now on Venmo, however you say it. I just posted a video about an hour ago. So I'm slowly getting more and more out there.
Very good. Good stuff. All right, Stephanie. It was a good talk, and we'll have another debate to line up next week at this time.
Right. Thanks for having me again.